Greetings, travelers. Welcome to another guide to a job or a class, depending on what I feel like calling it in the moment. Paladin is a job about righteousness and having a patron deity. Insert Necopara joke here. So logically, this is the job that you get for leveling Gladiator, which kind of feels like the rough equivalent of unlocking Saint by leveling Brute. Okay, maybe that's not as weird as it sounded to me at first. Well, if you want to become the only class in the game who actually uses its offhand slot, well, you were wrong, because crafters and gatherers use that slot as well. In fact, they have the exact same stance as Paladin if you enter battle mode as a crafter-gatherer. So if you wanted small swords and medium shields, you've come to the right place. Like other jobs I've talked about recently, you can start the game as a gladiator or unlock the class from Ul'dah if you want to become a paladin. If you don't like role-playing and you're on a certain server, my condolences when you do the gladiator questline. But if role-playing is what you are looking for on that specific server, you're already very close to the type of people that you're trying to find. I don't care what you like to do in this game, but if you're role-playing as a paladin who doesn't use tank cooldowns, I might role-play as an annoyed party member who doesn't type in team chat. Now that you remember to unlock the job quests at level 30, before we delve into some gameplay, allow me to make an addendum. When I made my Gunbreaker guide, I said that Gunbreaker has the worst overall mitigation of all the tanks. This statement can be debated a little bit, so allow me to start by being very clear. Not only are all tanks viable, it's not about the size of your mitigation that matters, it's how you use your mitigation to satisfy the content that matters. So proper preparation and experience will make it so that all tanks seem completely fine. However, between Paladin and Gunbreaker, there can be arguments made as to which one is slightly worse at tanking. Gunbreaker's camouflage cooldown, while good for trash packs, is not as powerful when getting blasted by a high-end tank buster, same with something like Heart of Stone. While Paladin has Sheltron that it can use fairly often, but it doesn't have a heal baked into its damage rotation, unlike every other tank. So instead of what I said about Gunbreaker before, I should say that in the current metagame, both Paladin and Gunbreaker do more damage than the other tanks while being slightly worse at tanking, while Dark Knight and Warrior do slightly less damage while being better at tanking. And according to conventional wisdom, Paladin is the squishiest of all the tanks. We're also talking about very small differences between these jobs, and I find that whatever tank you play the most ends up feeling like it has the best mitigation, simply because of what I said before about experience. As usual, the metagame should not really concern anyone these days, because Square Enix is very dedicated to making sure that every job can clear high-end content. Just to be aware though, Paladin has less effective health than all other tanks, and in a 2-tank scenario, it is probably more optimal to be used as an off-tank. When talking about Paladin, I will start in a different order than what you might expect from all my other guides up until this point. We're going to talk about buffs first. Paladin has 2 different DPS buffs. The first one is Fight or Flight, which you will be very used to seeing as you unlock it at a very early level. This buff increases all physical damage dealt by 25% for 25 seconds. However, at level 68, you will casually unlock Requiescat. When you read this tooltip, which I know all of you do, you might get confused at first. So when you use this skill, if you are above 80% mana or more, you will get this buff for the full duration. It doesn't matter what happens to your mana while this buff is active, all that matters is how much mana you have when you first use the skill. I cannot possibly be the only person who read this at first and thought that if I go below 80% mana, I lose the buff. If you thought that too, the answer is no. It probably could be worded a little bit better though. So this buff will increase all magic damage by 50% for 10 seconds, and at basically level 80, technically level 78, it will also make all your spells have no cast times. You can probably see where this is going. Paladin's 2 phases are based around these buffs. You will use your fairly normal damage rotation that you leveled with during Fight or Flight, and then have a spellcasting phase using Requiescat. Although you are ranged during your spellcasting phase, remember that Requiescat itself requires you to be in melee range to use it. And as a note, for both of these buffs, you want to maximize their duration by casting the buff immediately before you use the GCD, and not immediately after. This way you don't have the buff fall off too early and potentially miss a GCD that could have been under the buff. In the case of the opener, which I'm going to go over later, if you use Fight or Flight in a double weaving window, it's possible to ensure it gets delayed properly. But you are not going to have a damaged GCD to weave into that slot every single time. So getting used to not mashing Fight or Flight immediately after using Fast Blade and instead waiting to use it right before Riot Blade is good practice. It is possible that this isn't an issue for you if you have enough skill speed. But for me, if I use Fight or Flight too early, I miss out on a Goring Blade that could have been buffed otherwise. These buffs are important when discussing all of Paladin's gameplay, which is why I'm mentioning them up front, and with that explanation out of the way, you can probably guess what's coming next. That's right, it's the part of the video where I use my character to talk to the camera and ask you to support the channel. I am still fairly new to making videos, our community is growing at a very fast pace, and you too can contribute to feeding our demonic beast by subscribing to my channel, utilizing the like feature, and commenting on videos. I know most people don't care about me asking these things, but let me say that every single one of these segments makes me feel like an annoyance, but ultimately they do help the channel tremendously. As a reminder to everyone, I plan to do a karaoke livestream at 10,000 subscribers, a number that we have been reaching faster than I probably anticipated. And obviously I am not a great singer, which will make it even better. Although I don't make videos every single day, if you want to see more nonsense from me, I always stream my Statics raid attempts where we progress through the Savage tier, slower than a snail suffering from malnutrition. Thank you to everyone for the continued support, and may we all slowly move towards mediocrity. Alright, let's talk about some tank cooldowns. Our tank stance is called Iron Will, so make sure that bad boy is on while running a 4-man dungeon. Like all tanks, we have Rampart for 20% mitigation, and our 30% mitigation tool is called Sentinel. Never forget that Arm's Length is a tank cooldown for trash packs, but will also ignore most ragdoll mechanics in boss fights. Reprisal will afflict all enemies around you with a damage down debuff, which makes them deal 10% less damage. It is not as powerful for trash packs as other cooldowns, but it is very useful to reduce raid-wide damage from a boss. Now we can talk about Sheltron. Paladin does have a gauge that you build up during combat, which can be used on a variety of tank cooldowns, but will most commonly be used on Sheltron to guarantee that you block all attacks for 6 seconds. Blocking does not mean that you are immune to damage. Instead, blocking is a mechanic that occasionally happens where you reduce damage by 20%. It's similar to parrying, which will reduce damage by 15%. Sheltron makes it so that your block rate is 100% for 6 seconds. You will generate 5 gauge after every auto attack, which will also line up with every GCD, meaning you generally get 50 meter about every 25 seconds depending on your recast time, making Sheltron available very often. Great for trash packs when in between other tanking cooldowns, or just using 100 meter to use Sheltron back to back and block all attacks for 12 seconds. Paladin's party mitigation tool in the form of Divine Veil is weird. After casting this skill, if you receive healing from a healing GCD within 30 seconds of using it, it will give your party a shield for 10% of your maximum HP for 30 seconds after receiving that heal. Because as we all know, healing off GCDs are not considered to be healing magic cast by self or party member. What a perfectly worded and not remotely confusing tooltip. Usually you use this prematurely before your healers get ready for a raid-wide attack and you would receive healing by a GCD potentially. Or you can just scream at your healers to use a GCD with some kind of aggressive macro message. Alternatively, if you really want to proc it yourself, you can use Clemency. Your reward for going through all these hoops is shielding for less than Warrior Shake It Off. Passage of Arm is a skill to use during downtime and transitions between fights. You should never sit around like an idiot during combat, but you can weave it and immediately interrupt it to potentially mitigate the damage of a raid-wide attack. However, unlike Astrologian's Collective Unconscious, where a buff will last even if you're not sitting around, this buff will fall off the moment you interrupt it. It will only last for a server tick's worth of time, which is usually around 3 seconds. I want to be clear, these server tick alignments are not always consistent and it might last a little longer or a little shorter depending. You also have to angle it correctly as it only gives the damage reduction to the people behind you. You might as well try though, because as long as you don't interrupt your GCD cycles, it's not like you lost anything, and a 15% party mitigation is nothing to brush off. Lastly, Intervention will consume your gauge and give another party member 10% damage mitigation, but it will go to 50% mitigation if you pair it with either Rampart or Sentinel. This cannot be used on yourself and is not something that is typically needed unless your other tank really needs a cooldown and they don't have any. Of course, I haven't mentioned cover yet, but I am going over that later in its own segment, and that is every generic tanking cooldown that you have on Paladin. In reality, you don't have too many personal mitigation buttons, but Sheltron will be available very often. For this next segment, I'm going to talk about all invulnerability skills for all tanks. I haven't gone over every single tank yet, but this is the best time because Paladin has one of the simplest invulnerability skills in the game. Hollowed Ground is a cooldown that makes you immune to almost all damage in the game for 10 seconds. It does have a very long cooldown of 7 minutes though. It doesn't reduce you to 1 HP like Gunbreaker's Super Bolide, or require any sort of healing cooldowns for something like Dark Knight's Living Dead, or even Warrior's Holmgang. Using Hollow Ground even while tanking trash is completely fine because it's not going to put any sort of pressure on your healer for 10 seconds. It allows you to very seriously completely ignore mechanics in high-end content, not just from the tank side, but from the healing side as well, making it the best invulnerability effect in the game. Allowing your healers to continue damaging the boss like a good green DPS, because optimizing damage is not just about your DPS, it's about our DPS. So to give you a rundown, Hollowed Ground is a true damage immunity that lasts for 10 seconds and has a 7-minute cooldown. Gunbreaker's Super Bolide is a true damage immunity that lasts for 8 seconds and takes you down to 1 HP with a 6-minute cooldown. Dark Knight's Walking Dead is confusing, but prevents you from falling below 1 HP for potentially 10 seconds, provided you are healed to full HP before Walking Dead expires, and has a 5-minute cooldown. And Warrior's Holmgang simply prevents you from falling below 1 HP for 8 seconds and has a 4-minute cooldown. The reason why Hollow Ground can be the best invuln for an encounter is that if you're cheesing a mechanic that doesn't come up very often, you get a free pass on the mechanic and your healers don't have to heal you back up. However, the other best invulnerability in the game is Warrior's Holmgang, because despite having one of the weaker effects, its short cooldown means that if a mechanic comes up often, Warrior might be the only tank that can invuln it every single time. I would personally know about that with my Static and Litany Savage, with Gunbreaker and Dark Knight usually being somewhere in between in terms of usefulness. Gunbreaker might be able to invuln a mechanic more often than Paladin, but will require healing resources. And Dark Knight can technically remain at 1 HP for longer than Warrior, but will require more coordination with your healers. This is more important for healers than anyone else, but if you are very specific about party compositions, knowing what the invulnerability options are can help for strategies and high-end content. However, I highly encourage you to use Hollow Ground when doing big pulls in dungeons, because you might as well abuse how good the effect is, and you almost certainly will not need it for bosses. For an ability that is extremely niche, Shield Bash is something that you are basically never going to use at level 80. It is a GCD stun that interrupts whatever your current combo is. The only use case in normal content is if you absolutely need to stun an enemy and Low Blow is on cooldown. This is so insanely rare and would mean so much else is going wrong, you have bigger problems on your hands. However, in some circumstances, having a GCD stun can help for mechanics such as the Ad Phase and Eden 8 Savage. It's absolutely not mandatory in these types of scenarios, but sometimes it will make you more useful than any other tank. It is mostly a holdover from the olden days, but you might as well keep it around for the one time it is actually useful. Alright, for trash tanking, pulling mobs from afar with Shield Lob can usually be pretty standard practice. Have your 2-button AoE combo and Holy Circle on your hotbar. Once you have that trash pile at the size that you think your healer can manage, pop some sort of tank cooldown and use Requiescat. You can get 5 GCDs in under Requiescat, so you cast Holy Circle 4 times and then finish with Confidior. This will do more burst damage than using Fighter Flight on your default AoE combo. Remember to use Circle of Scorn whenever it's up because it's just free damage, especially in trash. And once you destroy your magic DPS buff with Confidior, switch to Fighter Flight and use your default 2-button combo until either you or the enemies die. And yeah, that's pretty much it. But just as a note, if Requiescat looks like it might fall off early, prioritize getting in that Confidior cast over using Holy Circle. As far as the order in which you use these buffs, it doesn't really matter, but I do find it easier to get a full Requiescat phase in, and it will do better burst for clearing the packs faster. Welcome to our opener. Something that's going to make this a little different when I talk about Paladin is, unlike most other classes in the game, Paladin doesn't have a super huge burst window where they want to shove all of their big damage cooldowns. Instead, it's more about using your 2 DPS buffs, getting the big damage skills in that utilize those buffs, and maintaining your dot combo on the boss. However, openers still try to take advantage of raid buffs, and this will borderline explain the entire rotation. So to begin, we're going to precast Holy Spirit about 2 seconds before combat. Once you are in range of the boss, we start our DPS rotation with Fast Blade. Immediately double weave Circle of Scorn, and then Fighter Flight. Use Riot Blade, and now you can use your dot in the form of Goring Blade. Start the combo over again with Fast Blade. You could use a damage pot here if that's what you want to do, and then use Riot Blade again, and weave Spirits Within. Now use Royal Authority. you can now use Atonement 3 times. As an aside, you can cast your dash move in the form of Intervene in between these casts for more damage if you aren't going to need them for mobility right away. And now we go back to our combo with Fast Blade, Riot Blade, but you should be able to weave Circle of Scorn here, and then reapplied Goring Blade. Fight or Flight is going to fall off now, and after that Goring Blade cast, it's time to use Requiescat. While in your single target spellcasting phase, you're going to use Holy Spirit 4 times, and then cast Confiteor. After that Confiteor cast, you should now have Spirits Within back up so you can weave that and go back to your normal rotation, starting with your dot combo, waiting until Fight or Flight finally comes back up. Great. That might seem like a lot, but this actually gives you an exact idea of what the standard rotation on Paladin looks like. Without Requiescat, you have 2 3-button combos, finishing with either Goring Blade or Royal Authority. You get Goring Blade first, and then you use your Royal Authority combo, use Atonement 3 times, and afterwards, you'll need to use your Goring Blade combo again because it's time to refresh the dot. The only thing that really changes is what you use in between each of these Goring Blade dot combos, either using Royal Authority and Atonement, or using Requiescat and to use your Holy Spirit Confiteor combo. Assuming you're using the standard opener that I just gave you, after you finish that spellcasting phase, you will use Goring Blade again, use your Royal Authority and Atonement combo with no buffs active, and then Fight or Flight will come back up again, and you are back at the start of the opener with using your dot combo. This is something that you'll just practice, but once you get the rhythm down, it has a very nice flow to it and feels very satisfying. It is a set rotation, so it's easy to know when you make a mistake. What I haven't mentioned yet is that Paladin has 2 openers at its disposal. You will typically use Fight or Flight first because it's better for damage, assuming that there are no issues with uptime. However, since Paladin does have a ranged phase with its spellcasting, in rare occasions, using ranged first might give you more uptime overall on the boss and will be an overall DPS increase. Or another thing is that a phase transition happens and it's better to get in a Confiteor cast rather than missing multiple atonements during Fight or Flight. This is something I encourage you to experiment with depending on what fight you are running and see which version feels the most comfortable for the content. I am not going to do a whole video demonstration for this version, but it's really not that complicated. We still get our 3-button dot combo down first, but we do not use Fight or Flight at all. Instead, after Goring Blade, use Requiescat and go into your spellcasting phase, finishing it with Confiteor, and then you go into your Fast Blade combo and cast Fight or Flight right before Riot Blade and go into your typical Fight or Flight phase with finishing the Goring Blade combo. This will change your phase alignment for the rest of the encounter and technically change your rotation with Requiescat always coming up before Fight or Flight. But like I said, when talking about the rotation, it's all about what you put in between your dots, so it doesn't really feel that different overall. Now it's time to talk about the most unique tank cooldown in the game. Cover is a skill that Paladin can use to divert 100% of the damage taken by another party member onto yourself. This will not only deal damage to you, but will consider you the target and will give you any debuffs that your other party member would have suffered as well. The party member that you use this on is effectively invulnerable while cover is active, although keep in mind that some attacks will go through cover. This also has a limited range, and when used, if you break that tether, the effect of cover will end. Paladin is the only tank that can do this. Realistically, this cooldown is never needed, but it can act as a get-out-of-jail-free card if you're in a dungeon and your healer is having a real bad day, allowing you to quite literally cover for them while they eat a million mechanics and possibly keep them alive. Alternatively, if you don't like tank swapping, it's possible to cover for the first hit of some 2-hit tank swap tank busters and then break the tether for your main tank to eat the real deal. This is not remotely necessary because Provoke and Shirk exist, but it is a valid option if you want to make sure that the boss doesn't wiggle around, or provoking and shirking with your other tank player is something that you just don't feel like doing in that moment. Now this skill is a bit weird to use and is going to feel a little janky because what attacks cover work on feels inconsistent, but honestly it's kind of fun that Paladin still has this unique capability that no other tank has while not being inherently game breaking. You might think to try to pair it with Hollowed Ground because your favorite Final Fantasy XIV YouTuber said to in a video that doesn't exist. Just know that all damage taken by cover will go through Hollowed Ground. It will not make both you and the person that you're covering invincible. What cover will do though is pass on any knockback effects that any party member would have received onto yourself, which is an important note if you ever use the skill. The only time it was useful for me was while leveling this class and saving a healer in Snowcloak who forgot about the hiding behind the icicle mechanic. Here is my buddy Austin and I recreating this as I demonstrate how cover still deals damage through hollowed ground. Even though cover is hardly ever needed, it is a pretty neat skill nonetheless. I give it an award for being the most interesting ability that is not remotely necessary. And finally, for other unique abilities, I'm going to mention Clemency. This is a healing GCD that you can use on yourself or on a party member, and its cure potency is 1200. You also receive 50% of the healing if you use it on another party member. Its healing potency will also be increased by 50% during Requiescat. The amount of raw healing output that you can do on Paladin with this skill is insane. Very capable of keeping your team alive in normal content all by yourself. But you know what you also have in your party? A healer. Assuming that they're doing their job at all, you will never have to use Clemency. Even if you think that they should heal more, it's generally not worth it. It's a GCD. You're not here to heal the party, you're here to maintain those DPS phases. Using Clemency while your healer is still alive is basically the gameplay equivalent of saying that they are a useless piece of filth. And while I do like feeling pain as a healer, this might cause people who haven't played enough Scholar to get upset. Instead, this skill should only be used in circumstances where you have no revives in your party and the healers are down and you can heal your party through the rest of an encounter because you know you can finish it. That is when you can become the true healing tank. But assuming everything is going well, you're never going to need to use it. Also, this ability allows Paladin to be a solid job when trying to go into old content unsynced because you don't need to bring a healer with you. You are the healer. The amount of sustain you get from this is quite incredible. In a similar vein to cover, this skill does not have to be used, but unlike cover, in the cases where you do need it, it is extremely powerful and game-saving. So keep it around somewhere as a last resort if everything goes to hell and you're the last thing to keep your party alive. But this is the most important skill that you should never have to use on Paladin. Alright, we're at the cooldowns to keep track of part of the video. It goes without saying at this point, but you plan everything in the world around Fight or Flight and Requiescat, both of which have 60-second cooldowns. Make sure you keep track of when each phase is coming up, and don't let these cooldowns drift too far apart from each other, but they should also never be active at the same time. Also, you might not be using these cooldowns the instant they come up, because you want to make sure that it lines up properly with your GCD phases, so you might have to wait just a little bit before you pop something like Fight or Flight. Spirits Within comes up every 30 seconds and should be used on cooldown. Don't worry if you're not at full HP, just throw it in there. And Circle of Scorn comes up every 25 seconds. It's not going to line up with everything else, but use it on cooldown as well. And finally, your dash ability with Intervene gains a charge every 30 seconds and can be used for extra damage if you don't need the mobility. And that's literally everything to keep track of on Paladin, damage-wise. For other utility, always have Interject in case there is something that must be interrupted in a fight. Low Blow can stun a single enemy, which is great when you don't feel like moving out of the AoE of a generic mob. Shirk is useful for tank swapping or putting aggro back on the main tank if you turned on tank stance 30 seconds into combat and overtook them on the enmity chart with your big optimized damage versus their puny freestyle button mashing. And Provoke is necessary if you are the off tank and need to get aggro because the main tank died, or for tank swapping in high-end content. And with all of that, that is everything I wanted to talk about with Paladin. I think overall, Paladin is a very fun job to play. Its rotation is satisfying and not super hard to learn, while maintaining a variety that doesn't get very stale. It also has unique attributes like a ranged phase that can allow it to maintain its rotation in segments where other tanks cannot, and also even has a janky, unique cooldown in the form of cover that allows you to do some different things that other people wouldn't immediately think about. Paladin can even turn into a healer that can carry a light party. Easily my second favorite tank class. Now let's get out there and cover for your healer. Hello again, travelers. It's me, the guy who edits these videos. As I am sure many are aware, this video is a re-upload with some major corrections. I want to be clear. I fucked up. There is no excuse for me making egregious errors in these videos, but giving people wrong information that can outright be harmful to their gameplay, such as saying hollowed ground can be used with cover, is not acceptable by any means. I am genuinely sorry. I know that expectations for my guides are getting higher, and I want to meet those expectations. Part of me still thinks that I have to do everything by myself in these videos, but moving forward to provide the best content for this series, I plan to make a community post for each guide that is an unlisted version that you can watch and help me catch any serious errors before I make a version that is completely public. I already do this behind the scenes for my friends to try to catch things, but obviously having more eyes is better. I do not have any plans to remake my older videos at the moment, but I am committed to making changes going forward. I know most of you probably don't see this as a big deal. I am mostly doing this for my own sanity. So once again, I am sorry, and I hope to see you in my next unholy concoction.